My name is Sophia. This happened 3 years ago when I was 19. My older brother Luke had just graduated from college in California, and the two of us were driving cross-country back home to New Jersey. Since he'd been living out there for 4 years, he had accumulated a whole apartment's worth of stuff. Furniture, electronics, books, everything, and there was no way he could fly back with all of it. But that wasn't the main reason we were doing it. I mean, cross-country road trip, sign me up for that any day of the week. I considered it a summer vacation, better even. We could have taken the direct route through Nevada and Colorado, but Luke wanted to see more of the country he'd been studying about, and I had never been to places like Zion or the Grand Canyon either, so we decided to take the scenic route along the southern edge. Luke insisted on renting a U-Haul instead of just shipping everything or selling it and starting fresh back home. Honestly, I think he was also trying to save money wherever he could, like a typical fresh college graduate. The U-Haul wasn't huge, but it was big enough that I felt like we were driving a small moving truck across the country. Before we left, both our parents and pretty much every travel forum we looked at had the same warning: be careful in New Mexico. It wasn't that the whole state was dangerous, but there were stories about scams targeting travelers, along with crime in some of the smaller towns and just generally sketchy situations in the more remote desert areas. Our dad specifically told us not to stop there unless we absolutely had to, and if we did, to stick to major gas stations and get back on the highway as quickly as possible. Luke and I agreed that we'd just drive straight through New Mexico without stopping. We'd fill up in Arizona, drive through as fast as possible, and stop again once we hit Texas. It seemed like a reasonable plan. The first part of the trip was amazing. Zion was incredible, and the Grand Canyon was everything I'd hoped it would be. Driving through Arizona was actually really beautiful in a way I hadn't expected, but somewhere in the remote stretch of New Mexico, our plan fell apart. The U-Haul was getting worse gas mileage than Luke had anticipated, and the gauge was dropping faster than we'd calculated. In hindsight, it was probably a little naive to assume we'd be able to make it through the whole state without stopping. We started looking for the next gas station along the highway, but according to our GPS, it was still about 40 miles away. The gauge was already below a quarter tank, and Luke was getting nervous about whether we'd make it. He pulled over to check the map, and that's when we realized we didn't really have a choice. There was a small town about 10 miles ahead that showed up on the GPS as having a gas station. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than risking running out of gas in the middle of the desert. The town was tiny, probably no more than a few hundred people, if that. It had that weird stillness that some small desert towns have, like everyone's inside hiding from the heat even though it wasn't particularly hot that day. There were a few rundown buildings, a small main street, and not much else. We didn't see any other travelers or cars passing through, which felt strange since we were still relatively close to a major highway. The gas station was one of those generic places with a few pumps and a small convenience store attached. As Luke was filling up the tank, I noticed we were getting some odd looks from the few locals who were around. Nothing aggressive, just lingering stares that made me uncomfortable. There was this guy leaning up against the convenience store smoking a cigarette who I kept catching eyes with, and I had to physically force myself not to look at him. I told myself it was probably just because we were obviously not from there, and we were driving a U-Haul with California plates, but nothing happened. After Luke finished fueling up, I tried to navigate us back to the highway. That should have been the simple part. We could literally see the highway from certain intersections in the town, but every road we took seemed to lead us further away from it. It was the strangest thing. We'd drive toward where we knew the highway was, and the road would curve or dead end or just take us in the completely wrong direction. It was like the entire town was literally designed to inconvenience us, as ridiculous as that sounds. And before you ask why we weren't using the GPS, well, we were. Or at least we were trying to. But it wasn't helping. It was clear that Google hadn't updated that location in ages, because the map kept routing us to roads that didn't exist anymore, or were inaccessible entirely. And on top of all of that, the signal was practically non-existent out there, so it would go through cycles of brief connection followed by nothingness for minutes on end. We ended up driving around the same few blocks multiple times, and I was getting increasingly anxious. Luke was trying to stay calm, but I could tell he was frustrated too. It started feeling more and more unnatural, Like there was something uninviting about that place that we were supposed to have stayed away from. I can't describe it, but that feeling of literally seeing the highway but never being able to actually reach it was just so bizarre and deeply unsettling. After another 20 minutes of driving in circles, Luke decided to go back to the gas station and just ask for directions the old-fashioned way. I begged him not to, but he practically yelled at me, saying we were literally trapped in the one place we were told to stay away from. I could tell he was pretty freaked out at that point, so I just kept my mouth shut. After returning to the gas station, he went inside while I waited in the van. When he came out, he had this worried expression on his face. He got in and said the guy working there had given him directions, but they seemed unnecessarily complicated. According to the clerk, we needed to drive 17 miles in the opposite direction from the highway through some desert back roads to eventually loop back to an on-ramp. I stared at him like he had lost his mind. In what world would we need to drive 17 miles in the wrong direction when we could see the highway from where we were sitting? I asked Luke what the guy was like, and he said he seemed friendly enough, but there was something off about how confident he was about the directions, like he was trying really hard to convince Luke that this roundabout route was the only way. Luke also mentioned that the clerk had been asking a lot of questions about where we were going and how long we would be traveling. Before I could even say it, Luke was like, "I don't trust it whatsoever. We need to get the hell out of here." He just started driving, and I didn't object. He eventually pulled over on a quiet side street to figure out what to do next. The GPS still wasn't functioning properly, and I felt myself beginning to hyperventilate. There was a little part of me that couldn't help but think something really terrible was about to happen. And then, as if on cue, a dusty pickup truck pulled up beside us. I felt my heart starting to race, and I looked over at Luke, who, from what I could tell, was already preparing to speed off should it come to that. The truck's window rolled down, and the guy asked Luke if we had broken down or were lost. Luke stared at the guy for a good few seconds before answering, clearly trying to gauge whether we were in danger or not. I sat there in the passenger seat trying to control my breathing. That's how freaked out I was. Had I been alone, I don't know what I would have done. After a tense few moments, Luke just said we were heading for the highway. He also described the route we were planning on taking to get there, which I realized were the directions the gas station clerk had given us. I didn't have the best view of the man from where I was sitting, but based on the tone of his voice, it sounded like he got really serious after hearing my brother speak. He asked us if we were crazy and said we should definitely not follow those directions. He went on to say that the route my brother had described would take us toward a really desolate area that was suspected to be a drug-running hotspot. Instead, he gave us alternate directions, then said it was a miracle we hadn't been robbed already, considering how clueless we were and how badly we stuck out, driving a U-Haul and all. Then, before we could even thank him, he drove off. Neither Luke or I said anything after that. Luke just started driving, following the man's directions. Sure enough, about a mile outside of town, there was this gravel road that was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. It was the least intuitive, most convoluted highway entrance I'd ever seen, but after following the road for a good while, it did actually get us back onto the highway, and that was that. Luke and I talked a little bit about the whole thing, but I don't think either of us wanted to harp on it too much. We obviously laugh about it now, and our whole family knows the story and asks us to tell it every so often, but at the time, it was the most unsettling thing that's ever happened to us. I'll never forget that indescribable feeling of being there. It was like this mix of dread and anticipation and anxiety blended into one. My brother described it as a kind of breathless limbo, where you're not quite suffocating, but you can feel it coming. I never want to experience that again.